The 8 American assets the government will confiscate first. The moment the system stops working. The first sign wasn't an explosion or a headline, it was a soft chime from a phone. A homeowner somewhere in Ohio tried to check their balance before heading to work. The message said, "Access temporarily restricted under Emergency Order 77B." At first, they thought it was a glitch. Then they saw the same warning on every screen: laptop, phone, ATMs, all showing the same notice. The local branch wouldn't even open its doors. No one had heard of this emergency order before, but by noon it was trending everywhere. Accounts frozen, transactions halted in the interest of national stability. Social feeds were full of questions no one could answer: how long, why, and who decided this? Within hours, stores limited card payments, gas pumps demanded cash, and cash itself vanished. People stood in quiet lines outside closed banks, staring at signs printed overnight. That might sound like a scene from a dystopian film, but the legal foundations that make it possible already exist, codified in statutes like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, 1977, and the Trading with the Enemy Act, 1917, both used repeatedly across U.S. history. The power to freeze, ration, requisition, or temporarily seize private assets lies dormant across multiple U.S. emergency statutes, each waiting for the right event. When the dollar weakens beyond control, those clauses can activate automatically. So we have to ask, when the next major devaluation hits, what will the government move to control first? Which assets are most likely to be protected by being confiscated? And what happens to ordinary citizens who discover that what they own isn't really theirs once the system decides it can't afford trust anymore? Tonight we'll follow that chain, from gold and retirement accounts to farmland, energy, even digital currency. Because when money collapses, it's not just the markets that change, it's ownership itself. And what looks like protection today could become confiscation tomorrow. Why seizures happen, the legal and economic setup. To understand how a personal bank balance could vanish behind an executive decree, you have to look at two worlds that rarely meet: emergency legislation and monetary collapse. One moves in the language of security and stabilization. The other deals in fear of inflation, of runs on banks, of losing control. When those two collide, private property becomes negotiable. Every modern economy keeps a break glass in case of emergency set of laws. In the US, those are the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, and the older Trading with the Enemy Act, TWEA. Together, they give the executive branch sweeping control during crises. Technically, these powers target foreign threats, but in practice, as documented in the historical use of IEEPA and TWEA, definitions can stretch when markets crash and confidence in the dollar erodes. IEEPA allows the president to freeze or block transactions during a declared national emergency, originally limited to foreign targets, but broad enough in interpretation to include domestic transactions supporting foreign-linked instability or major financial collapses. Freeze might sound temporary, but in practice, it cuts off access completely. No withdrawals, no transfers, no appeals. Then there's TWEA, born during World War I, refined through the Second World War, and still on the books. That one doesn't just freeze, it permits confiscation in wartime. And the line between economic war and national emergency has grown thinner with every new financial scare. Add to that the patchwork of asset forfeiture laws run by the Department of Justice, ostensibly targeting criminal gains, and you have a legal ecosystem ready for rapid control once policymakers label the moment as a threat. Here's how the mechanics work. Suppose the dollar begins to nosedive 15 to 20% in 6 months, similar to forecasts showing the DXY losing over 10% in the first half of 2025. Imports spike in price, inflation surges, and interest rates can't stop the spiral. Foreign investors pull out, cash floods overseas, as seen in 2025 models projecting weakening foreign demand, and the public panics. Under those conditions, a president can declare a national economic emergency. In the language of IEEPA, that unlocks all necessary means to regulate and prohibit transactions involving any property or interest in property. That phrase sounds like technical bureaucracy, but it can mean stopping transactions between ordinary citizens and the systems that hold their savings. Officials justify it through one of three phrases always repeated in crisis briefings: for stabilization, for national security, and for the public good. The specifics hardly matter, the pattern does. In the Great Depression, gold confiscation was framed as stabilization. During wars, food rationing became a patriotic duty. In every era, control began with calm language, temporary, limited, protective, and ended with a new definition of ownership. The deeper cause lies in the economics of confidence. Currency depends on collective belief. When that belief breaks, governments substitute force for faith. Freezing movement of assets buys time for policymakers, but at the cost of individual autonomy. People become data points in a macroeconomic triage plan. Imagine the human side of that for a moment. A family in Colorado wakes up to find their checking account inaccessible. Mortgage auto payments bounce back. The father drives to the bank hoping for a system fix, but inside the manager slides him a printed statement. All withdrawals suspended under executive directive. It doesn't matter that their funds come from decades of work. The system treats every dollar as potential instability. Later that night, news anchors call the measure a swift move to restore order. By the end of the week, nobody remembers the word ownership. They talk about access like it's a privilege. These events follow a rhythm historians know well. When financial systems strain, governments reach for visible symbols of authority, things the population recognizes as wealth. They start with gold because it carries mythology and visibility. Then they move to paper-based instruments like retirement accounts, those built into the nation's fiscal structure, then property, then resources. The order changes, but the motive doesn't. Preserve the structure even if the cost is public trust. Currency collapse accelerates this logic. When the dollar devalues, everything denominated in dollars loses meaning. The government's first instinct isn't usually to confiscate, it's to stabilize by containment, prevent money from fleeing into assets they can't trace. But containment quickly demands control, and control soon becomes possession. That's how freezing becomes seizing. Legally, the distinction is everything. A freeze means the owner technically retains title but can't use or move the asset. A seizure transfers ownership outright to the government. Yet to the person affected, the difference feels cosmetic. Locked is locked. Both actions can be justified under sections of the same emergency order. And because the criteria for foreign threat or economic instability are defined by executive discretion, almost any systemic crisis can qualify. What makes this setup especially volatile now is the digitization of assets. In 1933, gold sat in safes and drawers, hard to locate without physical searches. Today, wealth exists as records. Banks, brokerages, and exchanges already comply with Know Your Customer frameworks and anti-terror finance regulations. The infrastructure for instant freezing isn't hypothetical, it's operational. A single notice from the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control can cascade through every financial institution in seconds, turning balances into numbers you can't touch. Multiply that by nationwide temporary restrictions during a currency event, and you get a silent confiscation, software scripted, legally sanctioned. Defenders of this framework say it's necessary. Without such powers, speculation and panic could topple credit markets entirely. They argue that short-term control prevents long-term collapse, that freezing money is like pausing a heart to perform surgery. It sounds rational on paper, but history suggests that once emergency powers expand, they rarely contract. Each use becomes precedent for the next. Economists point out another paradox. Whenever a government simultaneously prints money to relieve debt and restricts access to private capital, it signals internally that confidence is gone. Citizens start holding hard assets, trading in foreign currencies, or moving wealth offshore. The state responds with stricter controls, feeding a loop of fear and enforcement. At that point, the economic motive merges with political necessity. Stability becomes synonymous with obedience. The constitutional guardrails exist, but they're fragile under stress. The Fifth Amendment promises just compensation for takings, but emergency orders often bypass the ordinary courts until long after decisions are executed. Legal scholars call it retroactive review. By the time the judiciary rules, the property's already changed hands. All of this sets the stage for how seizures unfold in practice. They rarely begin with violence. They begin with language, temporary, limited, for your safety. Asset control is always sold as protection, never punishment. People comply because they assume it's about someone else: foreign banks, billionaires, speculators. By the time the reach expands to them, it feels too late to resist. So when you hear policymakers discuss containing market volatility, what they're describing could be a controlled freeze of transactional flows, your ability to move savings, trade stocks, or even make large purchases. It's not theft, it's macroprudential response. And once enacted, it normalizes intervention as an economic reflex. That's the legal and psychological ladder. Panic prompts policy, policy creates precedent, precedent enables control. Each step feels temporary until it does, which brings us to the first rung where visibility matters most: gold and precious metals. Historically celebrated as the last refuge of value, they also form the easiest symbol for government reassurance. If the crowd panics, the state reclaims the shine and trusts the people will follow. Asset 1: gold and precious metals. When confidence in paper fades, people reach for metal. That instinct never changes. In every crisis, gold becomes both comfort and target, the one thing governments can't print yet always find a reason to claim. In 1933, it began with a radio announcement from President Franklin Roosevelt telling Americans that holding their own gold was now against the law. Within weeks, an executive order, No. 6102, forced citizens to surrender all gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve. The compensation seemed fair then: $20.67 per ounce. But just months later, the government raised the official price to 35. Overnight, private savers lost 40% of their wealth in real terms. It was called stabilization. It was confiscation by redefinition. That moment has haunted every conversation about financial control since, because it proves something chilling. Confiscation doesn't need armed raids, it only requires compliance. Back then, gold ownership was traceable through bank records, mining companies, and storage receipts. Today, it's simpler. Every bullion dealer, digital metals platform, and storage vault logs and reports transactions. Electronic traceability turns secrecy into an illusion. A modern version of 1933 wouldn't need agents knocking on doors. It would start with email notices and transaction blocks. Picture a notice that reads, "Under the National Economic Emergency Transition Act, all physical gold holdings above 5 ounces must be declared and converted into treasury certificates at prevailing stabilization rates." It'll sound procedural, wrapped in technical jargon. For small investors with accounts tied to online brokers or precious metal funds, conversion could happen instantly, balances swapped for digital credits before they even respond. The government wouldn't need to send trucks. The network would do the collecting automatically. Some might argue there's no reason to fear such a move today. After all, gold isn't central to the modern monetary system, but that's exactly what makes it useful for messaging. During upheaval, leaders look for symbolic gestures that tell citizens we're taking control. Gold represents control. Announcing a temporary gold consolidation sends a signal: trust the state, not the markets. Behind closed doors, policymakers could frame it as protection against hoarding or currency manipulation. The public narrative writes itself to ensure fair distribution of stability assets. History also shows how language disguises loss. Roosevelt never said confiscation. He said a measure necessary to protect the currency system. Citizens who resisted were threatened with 10 years in prison or a $10,000 fine, staggering penalties for simply keeping what had been legal yesterday. Compliance was near total because opposition felt unpatriotic. The same dynamic holds power now, only the mediums have evolved. Instead of patriotic duty, officials might invoke national cybersecurity or systemic risk mitigation. The moral pressure stays the same: cooperate for the greater good. Modern traceability makes targeted action frighteningly efficient. With most gold purchases processed electronically, authorities can identify every owner within hours. Dealers already follow anti-money laundering protocols mandated by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Precious metal IRAs must report holdings. Shipping companies track serial numbers and deliveries. A coordinated audit could expose the entire domestic gold network at the click of a few authorization keys. And since physical bullion often sits inside insured vaults or bank deposit boxes, access is already centralized. One directive could reclassify those vaults as strategic reserves. For independent holders trying to stay invisible, the options shrink. Private sales leave digital footprints. International storage faces customs declarations. Even privately mined or gifted gold becomes risky when trade restrictions tighten. Anyone attempting to convert it into cash or crypto might trigger automatic reporting flags. In an emergency framework, those flags can justify seizure pending verification. It's bureaucracy disguised as law enforcement, and it silently transfers ownership from citizen to system. You can see the pattern unfolding through subtle changes in regulation. Since 2025, there's been increasing integration between financial intelligence networks and commodities dealers. Combined with digital payment reforms, the data web grows tighter each year. In a currency collapse, that infrastructure converts from monitoring tool to enforcement arm. And remember, under IEEPA, once a national emergency is declared, almost any transaction involving a property of interest can be restricted. That phrase is wide enough to cover nearly everything with a serial number. There's also a psychological trap here. Many small investors think gold will shield them from devaluation. It's a comforting narrative: hard metal equals freedom. But in practice, the same statistical surveillance that guards against fraud also maps every ounce you own. Once recorded, it's controllable. Confiscation no longer needs a man with a warrant, it only needs a database query. Consider the hypothetical. A retired engineer in Arizona spends years converting savings into physical bullion stored at a private facility registered under his name. The dollar weakens beyond control, investors rush metal markets, and the government issues a stabilization order. Overnight, the vault reports all holdings. His access code stops working until compliance verification clears. Official representatives call it temporary. Weeks stretch into months. The metals remain locked for system balance. He's never charged with a crime, but his hedge against crisis turns into another frozen asset. That's the essence of modern confiscation. It redefines ownership as permission granted by system status. Supporters of emergency authority often promise compensation if assets are requisitioned, but compensation in what? In 1933, citizens were paid in dollars that instantly bought less. In a 21st century reenactment, compensation might come as treasury-backed digital credits redeemable after stabilization, currencies born from the very collapse they replaced. So people might receive numbers with new logos while losing the inflation-proof value of the metal itself. Legally fair, materially devastating. Some analysts insist this is unlikely because it would undermine confidence further. They underestimate how crises shift priorities. Maintaining public narrative outweighs preserving individual balance sheets. A gold surrender program framed as patriotic stabilization could rally markets temporarily while masking deeper shortages of trust. Central banks already hold vast reserves. Consolidating private holdings merely strengthens their leverage in international settlements. It isn't conspiracy, it's accounting logic. There's an irony hidden in all this. The same populace encouraged to diversify and safeguard wealth through tangible assets may one day find those assets labeled systemically critical. In polite language, that means subject to oversight and appropriation. Just as 1933 citizens learned too late that convertibility was conditional, modern investors could discover that possession depends on electronic approval. The metal never disappears, it just changes custodians. So when the next emergency headlines announce temporary stabilization of physical bullion markets, remember the euphemisms. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes in bureaucratic prose. The first American gold confiscation happened during a deflationary depression. The next, if it comes, could unfold during hyperinflation, and this time it won't need to knock. Everything from mining output to private safes already exists on a digital ledger waiting for reclassification. This is where the pattern begins. Control starts with symbolic assets because symbols mold belief. Seizing gold tells the population the old rules are over, a new order governs value. Once that message lands, the path to broader financial absorption, retirement savings, property, even cash opens naturally. If they can reclaim the metal that represents freedom itself, everything else looks negotiable. Asset 2. Private retirement accounts. If gold represents tangible value, retirement accounts represent faith. Faith that promises made decades earlier will still mean something when you need them. But in the aftermath of a collapsing dollar, that faith becomes liquidity, and liquidity is the one thing a government running on fumes can't resist touching. Inside American retirement systems sit roughly $40 trillion, spread across 401(k)s, IRAs, and pension funds. Every paycheck feeds them, every market rally fattens them. They're the quiet engine beneath the consumer economy, and in a crisis, they're the largest accessible pool of stored wealth besides national reserves. For policymakers battling a depreciating currency, those accounts look less like personal savings and more like stabilization capital waiting to be redeployed. The narrative would start gently. Officials wouldn't call it seizure, they'd frame it as protection, to shield retirees from market volatility during this period of financial instability. That phrase alone would calm headlines for a week. Then would come details: temporary conversion of retirement fund holdings into guaranteed federal annuity bonds, instruments backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. That's how quiet nationalization works. It borrows familiar language, so nobody notices the new math underneath. History offers blueprints. When Argentina's economy imploded in 2008, the government absorbed private pension accounts, issuing state bonds in return. Citizens were promised safety, they received decades of devalued payments. Hungary did something similar in 2001, pressuring citizens to move private funds into a public system for security. Both governments justified these moves as measures to protect savers. In both cases, the state used the confiscated assets to cover national debt. Now picture that script transposed to Washington. A dollar collapse pushes interest rates sky high, treasury auctions struggle to find buyers, debts must still be serviced. Trillions in dormant retirement assets suddenly look like a rescue line, convert them into government-backed paper, and obligations shrink overnight. Economists call it domestic debt consolidation. Citizens call it losing control of their futures. The selling language almost writes itself. Agencies would promise that account balances remain untouched, merely redirected into safer instruments. In practice, those instruments would yield negative real returns as inflation runs wild. And because retirement assets are tax-advantaged, they already sit under federal visibility. Custodians must report valuations, contributions, distributions. No hiding, no delay. Transforming them into government liabilities is a matter of policy signatures, not logistics. Imagine the rollout. A sleek broadcast from the Treasury building flags behind the podium. The secretary reassures millions watching, your savings are secure, we're ensuring continuity and protecting your retirement from speculative losses. The next morning, notices arrive in employer dashboards, accounts temporarily locked for restructuring. The fine print explains conversion terms, opt-out options come with penalties. Within days, trillions transfer from diversified funds to Treasury-managed vehicles. The public calls it confusing, markets call it obedience. For the small investor, this doesn't feel like confiscation. Balances still exist on screens, statements still arrive, but the assets underneath have changed species. Where there were equities, now there are government promises. Try withdrawing early and access falls under stabilization exemptions. You'll receive credits redeemable after the emergency ends, whenever that might be. The precedent isn't foreign. During World Wars, the US sold Liberty bonds by appealing to patriotism. The difference now is coercion masked as care. In a hyperinflation crisis, official messaging would blend nostalgia with necessity. Our parents bought bonds to save democracy, now we invest to save stability. Behind the sentiment lies a forced loan extracted from the public under moral supervision. Retirement custodians would have little room to resist. Regulations already bind them to federal oversight. The Internal Revenue Service and Department of Labor monitor plan compliance. The Securities and Exchange Commission governs fund operations. A single emergency order aligning those agencies turns voluntary management into mandated national service. Fund managers reclassify assets under new codes. Brokerage restrictions ensure no capital flight. Participants scarcely notice until quarterly statements start listing Federal Annuity Series 2035, where mutual fund tickers used to be. The human cost hides in time, not numbers. Consider a nurse in her early 50s who spent 30 years contributing to a 401k. She's seen recessions before, but this one feels different. The markets swing like metronomes set to panic. One morning, her account dashboard displays a red banner, portfolio temporarily transitioned under National Stability Act. Her investment mix resets automatically. She hasn't lost money, the message insists, just transition to protected holdings. Months later, inflation erases purchasing power faster than her new interest rate adjusts. She retires on schedule, but her annuity check covers half of what she once expected. Nothing she did was illegal or reckless. The framework around her shifted and her future was repurposed for national need. Experts would back the policy as pragmatic. They'd say it prevents seniors from devastating losses during market freefall. Technically true, there are no losses if trading stops. What disappears is freedom of allocation. Collective protection replaces individual choice, and the line between retirement system and state treasury dissolves. Legally, an operation like this could pass under existing authority. Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act allows emergency lending secured by any sound asset. Pension holdings qualify. Combine that with powers under the Defense Production Act and financial stabilization clauses, and the architecture for compulsory bond conversion already exists. Congress might later ratify it, retroactively approving the transfer as necessary to preserve the dollar's integrity. The courts, overloaded with petitions, would rule years after the damage settles. Public reaction would divide along generational lines. Younger savers still contributing might accept it as pragmatic realism. The state protected grandma's pension, who are we to complain? Older retirees would see betrayal but find few alternatives. Hard currency would be scarce, capital controls block offshore transfers. The social mood shifts from outrage to fatigue, the most reliable ally of policy drift. In the media, analysts debate whether the move amounts to reallocation or appropriation. But by the time that argument trends, implementation is complete. Payout schedules adjust to government calendars, interest rates fix below inflation targets, and the surplus generated through those suppressed returns quietly feeds federal bond rollovers. It's accounting efficiency at human expense. Why target retirement accounts so early in a crisis? Because they combine visibility, volume, and legal plausibility. Every citizen owns one, so the policy feels universal. Every balance sits on record, so enforcement is frictionless. And because they're for your future, the government can claim moral authority while they borrow your past. Unlike property seizures or bank freezes, there's little immediate pain, just deferred value bleeding out over years. That makes it the perfect confiscation. Invisible in the moment, devastating in hindsight. Once those funds are absorbed, confidence briefly rebounds. Markets stabilize on paper, foreign creditors cheer the demonstration of control. Yet beneath that calm surface, trust corrodes. People start looking at physical assets differently. They realize that if even their future was negotiable, anything tangible could follow. The shift is psychological ownership reimagined as conditional citizenship. By then, the machinery is running. Gold has been collected, retirement savings converted. The next logical step is property, the one form of collateral everyone assumes the system can't touch. When liquidity dries up and debts remain, governments reach for land. And the language you'll hear will sound familiar: temporary measures, compensations promised, nothing to fear. But as history keeps reminding us, the moment value outweighs law, the law bends. Asset 3: real estate and farmland. When paper money falters, people turn to land. You can't print acres or walls, and that makes real estate feel safe until the rules of ownership quietly change. In an economic emergency, property becomes policy. Mortgages, deeds, and titles convert from private instruments into tools of stabilization, and for governments running out of liquidity, land is the last negotiable asset left inside the border. Here's the setup. As the dollar devalues, interest rates climb in a desperate defense. Mortgage costs explode, housing demand vanishes, and refinances die. Banks sit on unpaid loans that erode in real value, while foreign investors carrying stronger currencies see American land as a bargain. The result looks paradoxical. Locals can't borrow, foreigners overpay, and policymakers panic about strategic assets falling into foreign hands. The easiest public answer: intervention. Call it stabilization or recovery, but the logic is unmistakable. Control the property base before it escapes national reach. Legally, that path already exists. The Constitution's takings clause allows property requisition with just compensation, but emergency frameworks blur definitions. During declared disasters, the federal government can seize or lease private land for recovery operations. Add an economic collapse emergency to that list, and disaster recovery zones become fiscal catch-alls for controlling resources. Under the National Defense Resources Preparedness Order, even farmland can be placed under Department of Agriculture allocation if it's deemed vital to food supply. What begins as preservation can drift into possession. Consider the numbers from the 2025-2026 forecasts. Analysts predict foreign capital flooding U.S. real estate once the dollar drops 15 to 20%. Luxury markets rise, rural assessments stagnate, and domestic buyers get priced out by inflation. Officials step forward announcing protective oversight for national property assets, language engineered to reassure. But oversight needs enforcement. Suddenly, counties designated as strategic agricultural regions require federal review before transactions. Leases extend indefinitely pending stabilization. Titles remain on paper, but operations, rents, and access fall under government supervision. De facto seizure without the optics. Eminent domain, long used for highways and public projects, mutates under stress. Instead of building roads, it builds fiscal walls, properties temporarily utilized to balance local infrastructure projects funded by federal emergency grants. Owners receive compensation denominated in a currency still falling in value, while occupancy shifts to entities administering relief. The fine print explains it neatly. Reversionary interest will be restored after emergency abatement. Only no one defines when an emergency ends. Across history, land control has been the final phase of economic intervention. In the Great Depression, farms were foreclosed en masse. During wartime, factories and housing were requisitioned for production. The pattern repeats because land is immobile and visible. It demonstrates authority. During crisis debates, officials frame it as protection against speculation or foreign takeover. Ordinary citizens, desperate for stability, rarely protest. They interpret seizure as order returning. Let's humanize that. Picture a fifth-generation farming family in Kansas. Inflation has doubled their fertilizer costs. Export contracts vanish as currency exchange destabilizes. They're behind on payments, but the land is mostly equity. Then a letter arrives from the local stabilization board. Pursuant to Emergency Agricultural Sustainability Directive 24C, your property has been designated for cooperative lease to ensure national food continuity. It mentions fair compensation, indexed to Treasury stabilization credits. Days later, federal trucks roll in with new signage, managed agricultural zone. The family stays on as contract operators. Technically, they're tenants on their own land. Official narratives call it temporary. They always do. But temporary programs require administration, and administration demands budgets funded by confiscated revenue streams. Counties accept federal grants tied to compliance. Property tax systems revalue land under special use. Over a fiscal year, private farmland morphs into managed territory. Titles still exist for appearance, use rights don't. Urban property faces a different mechanism. With mortgage lenders collapsing from default chains, the government forms a residential stabilization trust. It purchases non-performing loans, restructures them under public management, and forecloses on delinquent owners for community preservation. It's foreclosure wrapped in humanitarian language. Vacant properties become rental inventories administered by quasi-public housing authorities. Investors lose deeds, but hear patriotic slogans about keeping families sheltered. Foreign buyers complicate this picture further. When capital surges into cheap U.S. assets, Congress reacts with protectionist bills limiting foreign ownership of farmland and residential portfolios. Enforcement means forced divestment or state acquisition. Once precedent exists for forced sales, extension to domestic owners under currency integrity provisions is bureaucratic drift, not conspiracy. A Treasury-backed land security office could justify purchase or lease mandates as monetary defense measures, sacrificing private ownership to maintain domestic control of collateral value supporting federal debt. Meanwhile, inflation manipulates perception. On paper, property values might soar, but real value collapses. Higher nominal assessments increase tax obligations. Local governments, also bleeding from the dollar's decline, raise emergency mill rates to cover expenses. Owners unable to pay taxes lose property through legal channels indistinguishable from confiscation. It's eviction by spreadsheet. In urban centers, another dynamic unfolds. As foreign capital retreats and lending vanishes, city councils declare redevelopment moratoriums. The Federal Housing Stabilization Office steps in, citing critical infrastructure continuity. Large property management companies, heavily leveraged, accept government partnerships to stay solvent. The state gains partial ownership in exchange for relief funding, effectively nationalizing rental markets. Once that model stabilizes cities, rural land networks follow. The justification remains uniform: to avoid collapse of essential housing and agricultural supply chains. Real estate also acts as a psychological anchor. People trust that homes root them against chaos. When even that ground shifts, morale plummets. The government knows this, so confiscation arrives wrapped in reassurance, officials hosting community briefings about temporary stewardship programs. Yet the shift from owner to participant is subtle. The paperwork changes pronouns, not faces. You retain occupancy rights under Section 9 Stabilization Partnership. Behind the civil tone lies a clause stating that failure to comply with production quotas, rental limits, or maintenance standards invites federal reassignment for operational efficiency. Ownership becomes performance-based citizenship. The constitutional defenses exist, but like during financial seizures, due process lags behind execution. Citizens can sue for compensation, but payments emerge years later, adjusted for inflation that already have them. Courts interpret emergencies generously. Judges rule seizures lawful because stability outweighs individual hardship. Each decision cements new precedent, making the next takeover easier. Economists point out another twist. When land transfers from private to public hands, collateral for currency issuance strengthens, at least statistically. By converting real property into government inventory, the Treasury gains tangible backing for emergency credit lines. That data point can reassure international lenders even as citizens lose control of physical territory. So while officials promise future restoration of deeds, the macroeconomy counts the assets as sovereign reserves. To the homeowner or farmer, the experience doesn't feel political. It's paperwork that never ends, permits replaced by contracts, signatures refiled under new departments. They keep working the same soil, paying taxes under new terms, believing restoration will follow resolution. But as months become years, the borders between private and state ownership dissolve into administrative gray. The justification narrative closes cleanly. Your land helped feed the nation during hardship. Few argue with that. Patriotism softens confiscation. And by the time stability returns, inflation, taxation, and legal inertia make repurchase impossible. The titles revert, but the debts tied to them anchor ownership to policy. The property is yours only if you keep serving its new public function. That's the quiet power of land seizures in a currency collapse. They rarely unfold through bulldozers or flash headlines. They unfold through valuation formulas, leasing directives, environmental audits, and tax liens, each one defensible in isolation, devastating together. By the time citizens notice the pattern, control has shifted without a single dramatic announcement. From that vantage, the next frontier becomes obvious. When property can be temporarily borrowed, what remains untouchable? Liquidity, cash access, the flow between accounts that still gives citizens mobility. Because once the land and buildings are accounted for, the system turns to what everyone assumes they still own, their money sitting safely inside banks. And that's where the quiet confiscation moves from paper boundaries to digital codes. Asset 4: bank deposits and digital cash. Control ends where liquidity begins. You might think the money sitting in your bank belongs to you, that as long as the numbers appear on your screen, you're safe. But in a collapsing dollar environment, bank deposits aren't assets, they're obligations. And obligations can be repurposed overnight. The modern banking system already operates on layers of permission. Every balance is a promise filtered through software, regulation, and government backstops. All it takes to convert ownership into limitation is an executive order framed as stabilization. During previous financial shocks, officials closed banks for cooling periods. In 1933, Roosevelt's 4-day banking holiday seemed temporary but reset the nation's monetary foundation. 80-plus years later, the tools are digital, but the logic is identical. Freeze transactions to halt panic, declare the freeze a success, then reopen under new rules. Only this time, code replaces padlocks. The first domino in a modern collapse isn't the value of cash, it's access to it. Under Dodd-Frank regulations introduced after 2008, large financial institutions no longer rely on taxpayer bailouts, they rely on bail-ins. That means depositors, ordinary people, become involuntary creditors if the bank wobbles. Instead of government funds rescuing the institution, your savings automatically convert into equity or frozen claims pending resolution. It's legal, automatic, and invisible until it's already happened. Now layer on the emergency powers embedded within IEPA or the Defense Production Act. When the Treasury or Federal Reserve declares systemic instability, they can restrict withdrawals, transfers, and foreign transactions. Officials call it temporary liquidity management. Customers call it being locked out of their livelihoods. The rhetoric shifts fast. Phrases like preventing capital flight and ensuring dollar integrity flood press conferences. Nobody uses the word confiscation. In official language, you don't own frozen funds at risk of reallocation. You possess restricted access balances. The path from freeze to seizure runs through perception. Digital finance changed the texture of ownership. People equate seeing a number with having control. But deposits exist only as entries within bank ledgers backed by reserves that may vanish. If the dollar weakens 15–20%, imports surge in cost, defaults climb, and banks face capital shortfalls. At that threshold, regulators step in with macro-prudential containment orders. Transfers exceeding capped limits pause, withdrawals over set amounts require justification, cross-border payments flag as suspicious. Each restriction announced as temporary protective. Together, they spell financial paralysis. Picture the small business owner in Minneapolis opening his laptop before dawn to run payroll. The dashboard refreshes with a red header, transaction functionality temporarily suspended for system stabilization. Payroll can't process, employees' cards decline at gas stations within hours, calls to customer service yield scripted lines. We're updating infrastructure for your security. By midday, ATM limits drop to $20. Lines stretch down sidewalks, echoing 193's newsreels, except now the panic spreads in seconds through social media. Yet broadcasts reassure viewers, liquidity pause successfully prevents contagion. What happens inside those closed digital doors is an algorithmic triage. Banks communicate directly with regulators through secure lines, reporting position gaps. In exchange for emergency liquidity, they pledge customer deposits as collateral. The move stabilizes institutions at the expense of depositors' freedom. You haven't lost your money, the state now co-manages it. Withdraw later after system reconciliation. This structure connects seamlessly to emerging central bank digital currency designs. A CBDC promises transparency and efficiency. In crisis rhetoric, that reads as precise control. Each unit of currency carries programmable conditions, usable for rent, not for foreign transfers, active for 30 days before expiration, blocked for flagged users under sanctions review. Integrated with national ID systems, it creates absolute traceability. Once adopted as temporary relief currency, it welds policy enforcement into every transaction. Printing money isn't the solution anymore, permission is. Officials would market the transition as modernization. We're moving swiftly to ensure continuity in the payment network. Consumers download new wallet apps tied to existing bank accounts. Conversion occurs automatically. Old balances migrate into digital dollars backed by Treasury reserves. On launch day, screens light up with confirmation notices. People sigh in relief, not realizing they're agreeing to programmable compliance. Every purchase, withdrawal, or transfer now runs through a central switch capable of instant suspension. The next emergency order won't need coordination, it'll just flip variables from true to false. Critics will argue that such control could never reach private citizens without extreme cause. But bail-ins already reposition customers as unsecured creditors. Cybersecurity regulations permit indefinite account suspensions during data verification. Combine those with emergency economic declarations and the definitions merge. The legal infrastructure exists, the crisis provides the trigger. Think of Cyprus in 2013, when ordinary depositors woke to find accounts levied to rescue local banks. The losses were reframed as contributions to stability. The United States studied that model closely. Within regulatory texts, it's termed orderly resolution. That phrase alone should chill anyone assuming moral intent protects them from procedural reality. Under a dollar collapse, the narrative will shift from punishment to patriotism. Your deposits are helping rebuild the nation's credit foundation. To resist becomes un-American, to comply becomes honorable. Media stories humanize grateful citizens who did their part. Behind those headlines, transactional data flows into centralized liquidity pools. Your balance remains visible but unspendable except under approved categories: energy, food, essential transport. Private purchasing becomes contingent compliance. For policymakers, the benefits abound, hoarding ends, bank runs vanish, imports slow. For citizens, freedom contracts silently. And since most wages, taxes, and debts already route electronically, there's little escape. Withdrawals in physical cash trigger scrutiny, while digital transactions above thresholds hit weighting filters. The illusion of flexibility persists because everyday purchases still work: that bread, that bus ticket. But larger moves, wealth-defending moves, jam against invisible walls. Supporters inside agencies will emphasize fairness. Everyone sacrifices equally, yet systemic hierarchy guarantees exemptions. Large institutions negotiate bulk settlements behind closed doors, small savers queue for rationed access. When liquidity rationing drags on, rumors erupt about a conversion ratio, frozen deposits exchanged for long-term stability bonds. That's the moment freeze becomes seizure. Your checking account morphs into an involuntary loan to the government, issued in digits still labeled as dollars but redeemable in confidence, not reality. The emotional toll rarely makes reports. Families postpone tuition payments, mortgages collapse into arrears, suppliers demand prepayment in commodities instead of cash. Barter circulates under radar until enforcement teams warn against unauthorized alternative currencies. Online, influencers shout about blockchain escapes, unaware that major exchanges themselves now fall under emergency jurisdiction. Buying crypto with frozen fiat becomes impossible, the bridge between traditional and digital money raised permanently. Liquidity in every form becomes a gated privilege. Meanwhile, officials highlight success metrics: inflation flattening, exchange rates stabilizing, calm returning. They claim deposit freezes prevented chaos, that citizens' patience saved the financial system. Few notice the trade-off: the system survived by consuming its participants' agency. When accounts reopen, new terms appear: capped withdrawal frequencies, dynamic fees linked to economic indicators, mandatory CBDC integration. Compliance isn't optional, continued access counts as acceptance. Legal recourse trails far behind. Class actions filed decades later, arguing takings without compensation. Courts label them moot, exceptional circumstances justified extraordinary measures. Academia turns it into case studies about resilience. The people affected distill it into anecdotes. Remember the freeze? That's when everything digital stopped feeling like ours. Then comes normalization. Once society adapts to programmable currency, the concept of a personal bank balance changes forever. Ownership shifts from possession to permission, and the expectation of interruption becomes ordinary. Financial commentators reframe it as evolution, a smarter economy optimizing liquidity distribution. In reality, it's the end of untethered money. The trajectory is depressingly predictable. Deposits restructured into bonds, transactions gated, physical cash discouraged. Each step branded progress until the day dissent itself costs more than compliance. And through it all, the same comforting phrase repeats like a lullaby: your funds remain secure. Secure, they just aren't yours to move. Once that sentence loses meaning, the next wave of confiscation turns outward. If liquidity is programmable, control can extend beyond the ledger, into the energy, networks, and fuel that keep transactions alive. The vault doors may reopen, but the grid they rely on belongs to the same authority that froze them. And when regulators declare the next stabilization phase, even access to power could become another line item in the system's spreadsheet of national control. Asset 5: Energy and fuel supplies. In a world spinning toward currency chaos, control of energy isn't an afterthought, it's survival strategy number one. When a devalued dollar drives import prices through the roof and panic grips supply chains, every gallon, every kilowatt, and every cubic foot of gas becomes strategic. That's when national defense clauses meet fuel pumps and market rationing evolves into state-managed distribution. Energy, once a commodity, turns into currency itself. Here's how the scenario begins. The same emergency powers that can freeze transactions also give the executive branch the right to seize or redirect natural resources, essential to defense or public welfare. Buried inside the Defense Production Act and its dozens of amendments are provisions letting agencies dictate production quotas, requisition facilities, and allocate materials for national needs. During war, those powers target factories. During monetary collapse, they target energy, because keeping lights on equals preventing unrest. In practice, the Department of Energy joins forces with FEMA and the Department of Transportation under a critical infrastructure mobilization plan. The language will sound like reassurance, temporary coordination to stabilize distribution. But coordination means command. Private refiners must prioritize government contracts. Trucking routes carrying fuel submit to federal scheduling. Local gas stations receive mandated quotas. The market doesn't set prices anymore, policy does. Citizens barely notice at first. Headlines emphasize stability, fuel streamlined to protect frontline logistics. But inside the fine print of the order, residential deliveries and individual storage face new restrictions. Hoarding, always an ambiguous crime, gets redefined to include anyone holding more than 2 weeks of supply. Possession thresholds shrink as enforcement expands. The penalty framework cites wartime precedents even if no war is declared. Under the National Defense Resources Preparedness Order, unauthorized retention of essential fuels triggers seizure and redistribution. Confiscation in uniformed language. Imagine the human pulse behind that policy. A small construction firm in Texas keeps diesel tanks for backup equipment. Overnight, inspectors arrive citing Emergency Energy Security Directive 59. The tanks are sealed for audit, then marked for temporary reallocation to priority infrastructure. The owner, confused but cooperative, files for compensation. Weeks later, reimbursement comes as electronic credits indexed to falling currency. The worksite stands idle. The government calls it civic contribution. Energy control extends far beyond barrels. Once the system centralizes fuel, electricity becomes next. Federal statutes already empower the Department of Energy to assume authority over private utilities during declared emergencies. Grids become nationally integrated assets. Power companies turn into contractors operating under government dispatch orders. Load-shedding planned blackouts gets reframed as targeted conservation support. Families scrolling through outages online find heat throttled at predetermined intervals. The explanation scrolling like weather alerts. Temporary demand stabilization in progress. If that sounds implausible, remember the precedent. In 1979 and again during post-Katrina disruptions, presidents invoked powers to direct domestic oil production and ration refined fuels. The modern twist is data. Smart meters and IoT systems enable targeted control house by house. During a financial emergency packaged as an energy crisis, those same networks become enforcement tools. Consumption caps activate automatically. Exceed your quota, and your account status changes from civilian to reviewed. Payment surcharges or access restrictions follow, justified by national equity algorithms. The architecture's already there. Every pipeline, refinery, and utility connects to federal oversight through mandatory reporting protocols. In stable times, that ensures safety. In collapse, it ensures obedience. Executives who resist risk license suspension under critical infrastructure compliance mandates. For them, cooperation equals survival of the business. That's how voluntary alignment turns into quiet nationalization. Fuel reserves stockpiled for emergencies serve as both carrot and stick. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, traditionally a cushion for market shocks, becomes weaponized logistics. Releases prioritize government fleets, emergency vehicles, and logistical partners of approved critical missions. Civilian stations receive allocations calculated through centralized analytics claiming to optimize fairness. Reality feels different. Endless lines, ration stamps transmitted via app, fuel credits expiring if unused within set dates. Programmable scarcity replaces currency collapse headlines. Officials frame everything as continuation of service. We're keeping the country moving. Yet each control lever deepens dependency. Citizens who can't prove essential employment lose fuel access beyond daily commuting range. Travel begins requiring digital permits, QR code confirmations linking driver licenses to fuel entitlements. It feels organized until you realize mobility itself just became regulated behavior. Energy confiscation also functions as propaganda proof. When panic peaks, government cameras capture trucks loaded with fuel labeled for emergency response. TV anchors broadcast images of order, not shortage. The message, the state still provides. Behind that optics layer, the private networks supplying those shipments operate under federal custody. Distribution companies become temporary partners, warehouses tagged as strategic depots. If you're an owner, refusing cooperation reads as obstruction of national recovery, a prosecutable stance. Even renewables enter the dragnet. Solar farms, wind grids, battery warehouses, all subject to executive coordination orders. The Defense Production Act covers any resource needed to promote national defense, and in modern definitions, defense includes critical infrastructure continuity. So energy independence projects, the off-grid setup citizens built for resilience, are exactly the assets most at risk. A small community in Nevada that spent years building a solar microgrid might wake to find the array commandeered under the Distributed Power Integration Program. Technicians from contracted agencies arrive to sync it into the regional grid for stability. Locals still get power, but at metered allotments and new rates. Autonomy erased under administrative politeness. Economists debating such measures call them inevitable pragmatism. Large-scale fuel rationing, they argue, prevents riots and ensures food distribution. Technically true, but every justified confiscation hardens permanence. Once networks run efficiently under command, returning them to market seems risky. The bureaucracy that managed scarcity lobbies to remain. Histories filled with agencies born in crisis that never retired. The War Production Board, the Petroleum Administration for Defense. Each morphed into civil counterpart roles long after emergencies ended. Energy control won't vanish either. It just rebrands as sustainable governance. Consider the psychological calibration involved. Early rationing appears voluntary, public campaigns encouraging conservation. Citizens brag online about reduced usage earning digital badges, then gamification transitions into enforcement. Smart meter dashboards warn that excess consumption negatively affects community stability scores. Fines convert to automatic deductions from digital wallets. Resistance equates to selfishness. Confiscation by consent. Legal scholars acknowledge constraints supposedly protecting citizens. Fifth Amendment compensation, due process, administrative review. But during declared national emergencies, courts defer heavily to executive judgment. Precedent labels energy nationalization a legitimate defense measure. Plaintiffs arguing uncompensated takings face lengthy litigation while the regime stabilizes new norms. By the time cases close, control mechanisms feel natural, even desirable. Public resilience becomes the national tone. Meanwhile, rural America bears the brunt. Private fuel reserves on farms and construction sites draw scrutiny first because they're visible and valuable. Enforcement squads, called energy assurance teams, audit every industrial tank above set capacity. Those deemed inefficiently utilized undergo temporary transfer. Translation: confiscated and rerouted. Compensation arrives as digital credits redeemable for regulated prices. But by then, inflation ensures those credits buy less than half their promised value. It's not malice driving this shift, it's desperation. As dollar depreciation erodes purchasing power, the government can't afford uncontrolled consumption. Each additional barrel burned without oversight weakens its grip on inflation optics. Controlling supply becomes a cosmetic antidote, the illusion of restored balance. Citizens, too exhausted to parse motives, accept the trade-off: less independence for more predictability. And here lies the deeper pattern tying all confiscations together. Every energy seizure doubles as financial triage. When the state commandeers resource flow, it doesn't just keep engines running, it props up the collapsing currency by pegging distribution to controlled prices. Fuel credits replace cash, ration cards become monetary instruments. Policy analysts call it energy index stabilization. You might call it barter enforced by law. Weeks into this arrangement, people adapt instinctively. Long lines at ration stations shrink as digital scheduling spreads. Compliance becomes survival etiquette. Journalists celebrate ordinary heroes conserving power. Officials publish metrics showing reduced chaos. On paper, the plan works. In reality, the public forgets it ever owned fuel in a free market. Access feels like generosity, not entitlement. That's the psychological surrender every control strategy seeks. By the time reserves stabilize and markets technically recover, reprivatization looks dangerous. We can't risk volatility returning, experts warn. So command persists under a new guise: the National Energy Stability Corporation, half public, half private, forever temporary. And in that permanence hides the quiet truth: confiscation needn't announce itself with force. It arrives wrapped in courtesy, data dashboards, and conservation slogans. When energy flows become permissions, dependency completes its loop. The same lights that reassure you everything's fine now flicker only with authorization. And somewhere behind those digital switches sits the same authority that once froze your bank account, proving control of money and control of power were never separate acts but stages of the same script. Asset 6: Utilities and Communication Networks. When energy becomes a government instrument, what powers that energy soon follows. The pipes, wires, towers, and fiber lines forming the country's nervous system are the final levers of control. In any declared emergency, whoever commands those utilities commands silence and obedience. During a currency collapse, that control isn't theoretical. The laws already label them critical infrastructure, meaning they shift automatically to executive management once normal markets fail. It starts subtly. A press conference promises continuity of essential services. The president signs an order invoking sections of the Communications Act and the Stafford Disaster Relief Guidelines. Instantly, federal agencies gain the right to coordinate private carriers, utilities, and data networks for national resilience. The wording sounds benevolent, but coordination means commandeering without the optics of seizure. Every provider becomes a de facto branch of government logistics. Power, water, telecommunications, all regulated industries function through licenses. Those licenses depend on compliance. Under emergency activation, failure to follow directives can equal license suspension. So when FEMA or the Department of Energy issues a grid stabilization plan, CEOs nod and comply. They route maintenance schedules through federal dashboards. They prioritize supply zones designated as critical. Households experience shorter service windows, limited bandwidth, occasional brownouts. Officials explain it as fairness, allocating resources to maintain equilibrium. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a separate order covers what most citizens never think about: information flow. The Federal Communications Commission holds reserved authority to seize control of broadcast channels and satellite uplinks for purposes of national emergency communication. That includes cellular networks, internet backbones, and ground stations feeding everything from news feeds to GPS. Legal since 1934, updated for the 21st century under cybersecurity directives, it can redirect or suspend private operations with a phone call. During a digital bank freeze or power ration, informational lockdown keeps narratives synchronized. The fewer versions of truth circulating, the calmer the population remains. Imagine the rollout. Dawn in Los Angeles, signal strength drops to 1 bar. In rural areas, service disappears for infrastructure maintenance. Radio stations replay official updates on loop. A notice on every ISP homepage reads, to conserve bandwidth for critical applications, consumer streaming will be limited between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. The justification cites grid synchronization optimization. What it means? Entertainment throttled, distractions minimized, data pipeline cleared for government transmission priorities. The pattern mirrors wartime censorship but with automated enforcement. Owners of private networks realize quickly silence isn't profitable but compliance is. Telecom giants receive federal credits for stability cooperation, effectively paying them with the same weakened currency they help stabilize. Smaller providers without technical capacity merge under guidance from a new agency, the National Communications Continuity Corps. The merger rate breaks records, consolidation disguised as patriotic duty. Within months, fewer companies exist, each operating from identical manuals distributed by Washington. Choice evaporates in the name of efficiency. Utilities join the transformation next. Water authorities shift procurement under Department of Homeland Security supervision to safeguard purification agents. Local managers find instructions arriving daily. Adjust distribution pressure, maintain reserve capacity for essential facilities, limit residential flow after curfew. Smart valve systems make obedience effortless. Control signals travel faster than complaints. The average citizen experiences low pressure at night and calls it conservation. The reality, dynamic rationing trials for nationwide deployment. Parallel to physical utilities runs the control of digital arteries, the internet's core routing exchanges. Most exist as private consortia coordinating bandwidth between carriers. Under the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement framework, they already maintain access points for surveillance. Activate those lines in crisis and traffic filtering becomes centralized censorship. Official bulletins describe it as malware mitigation. The public reads that and nods, grateful someone's protecting them from cyber threats, while their posts about withdrawal limits vanish mid-upload. You might ask who decides which messages stay. The answer: Emergency Information Task Forces composed of agency representatives and corporate officers. Meetings happen over secure calls, decisions translate into algorithmic rules deployed across platforms. Disinformation flags expand into stability risk markers. Accounts discussing unauthorized financial alternatives drop to zero reach. Journalists appealing decisions find inboxes overflowing with automatic responses citing temporary communications prioritization. It's bureaucracy as silence. Meanwhile, cable networks and public broadcasters serve as morale conductors. Cameras film officials visiting control centers promising restoration. Footage from repair crews appears hourly evidence of care. The narrative sells cooperation as survival. People coping with blackouts share relief stories online, turning ration endurance into community virtue. When citizens praise reliability under scarcity, authority knows control has succeeded. Consider the household perspective. A family in Pennsylvania notices brief power flickers each evening. Then their utility app pushes a notification. To support stabilization, your service will automatically adjust during peak demand. Kilowatt quotas assign daily allowances. Exceed them and price multipliers activate or service pauses. For internet users, the pattern repeats, data caps labeled equitable bandwidth policy. What's being tested is compliance conditioning, rationing accepted through algorithm instead of law. Some might try self-reliance, generators, satellite dishes, private mesh networks, but new licensing regimes classify independent transmitters as interference sources. Inspectors arrive citing cybersecurity risk. Equipment confiscated, owners reimbursed in depreciating credits. The message is unmistakable. In a centrally managed crisis, autonomy equals noncompliance. Legally, every step fits within existing frameworks. The Communications Act grants seizure rights for defense. FEMA directives treat utilities as logistic assets. The Defense Production Act covers production and distribution of essential materials, including electricity. Combined, they authorize what amounts to functional nationalization. Judges defending these orders lean on precedent. Continuity of communications is critical to national survival. The phrase sounds unassailable, yet it grants limitless reach. The consequence extends beyond inconvenience. Once communications operate under single command, information becomes currency. Silence can reward or punish. Regions with high conformity receive stable service. Zones marked for unrest see extended outages justified by localized faults. Corporate partners quietly integrate stability metrics into coverage algorithms. Security becomes selective convenience. This setup mirrors strategies seen in smaller nations during periods of hyperinflation. Venezuela throttled social media to quell protests over devaluation. Egypt blocked messaging apps during financial panic. Western analysts frame those acts as authoritarian excess. Yet the same blueprints sit embedded in democratic legislation, unused, waiting for activation under nobler branding. The deeper transformation is psychological. Dependency on constant connectivity ensures people accept surveillance trade-offs in exchange for signal strength. When utilities and networks merge under crisis governance, protest risks self-inflicted blackout. Disconnecting means isolation, staying online means monitored compliance. Control through convenience. Some insiders justify the inevitability. In a digital nation, stability equals managed bandwidth. They're not wrong, but management becomes ownership once private switches answer to public commands. After recovery, agencies claim the systems performed heroically, so why disband them? Oversight committees propose permanent integration to guard against future instability. Congress applauds. Months later, emergency protocols morph into policy standards. The people never vote on this transition. They subscribe to it via monthly bills. Technically, compensation mechanisms exist. Companies requisitioned for service continuity receive tax relief and infrastructure bonds. Consumers allegedly benefit from uniform pricing. The bills still arrive, only the negotiable part, choice, is gone. Citizens experience predictability funded by lost autonomy. Now picture the economy months after stabilization. Energy rationing normalizes, utilities remain under semi-federal leases, communication networks continue content moderation for security. Journalists describing it as censorship are corrected by panels. It's information hygiene. Public trust metrics rise because people hear nothing upsetting. That's the ultimate efficiency, calm through controlled narrative. At the neighborhood level, adaptation feels peaceful. Streetlights function, water flows intermittently, internet streams prioritize content without buffering. The silent cost hides in the absence of surprises. Spontaneity itself becomes suspicious CPU activity flagged by algorithms tuned to detect instability indicators. And once citizens internalize that equation, predictability as patriotism, the apparatus no longer needs enforcement. The grid governs itself through human compliance. By this stage, ownership has faded entirely from concept. Whether it's power lines, bandwidth, or the phone in your hand, every conduit of modern life operates at permission granted. And that's precisely what currency collapse seeks to resolve. Replace trust with control so the system can reboot on force rather than faith. When the lights glow only at authorized hours and voices travel only through monitored channels, confiscation stops needing locks or keys. The grid itself becomes the gatekeeper. And the next asset waiting beyond that threshold, the food grown, processed, and distributed through those same controlled networks, will be rationed by the same logic of stability. The power lines may hum, but the signal they carry whispers the same message every previous confiscation taught. What you're allowed to use is what you no longer own. Asset 7, Food Supply and Agriculture Infrastructure. When the lights stay on only by permission and communication runs through filters, the next move is predictable: control what everyone physically needs every single day: food. During a dollar collapse, scarcity isn't just a fear, it's policy currency. Whoever manages supply distribution manages survival. Governments have known this for centuries, and the legal scaffolding to reclaim farms, silos, and distribution chains is already standing. All it takes is an executive signature declaring food continuity essential to national stability. History shows the blueprint. In wartime and pandemics, production orders under the Defense Production Act let Washington direct private manufacturing. Agricultural clauses stretch that authority across everything edible: crops, livestock, processing plants, trucking firms. On paper, it's ensuring fair distribution. In reality, it's state command of the dinner table. The new narrative sounds calm: temporary coordination between the USDA, FEMA, and private producers to maintain equitable access. Coordination becomes commandeering in a single paragraph. The logistical trigger arrives when import prices explode. A weakened dollar doubles the cost of fertilizer, grain, and fuel. Supermarkets see empty shelves inside a week. Public panic threatens riots. Within hours, emergency briefings begin. Phrases like National Nourishment Initiative roll out, soothing tone, vague detail. Behind the podium, agencies merge under a food supply stabilization task force. Their immediate goal: optimize production and distribution. The hidden clause: they can requisition facilities necessary for fulfillment of public nutrition objectives. Both the wheat field and the bread truck now technically fall under federal mission command. For the average citizen, this looks organized at first. Shelves refill, ration but orderly. Grocery chains post signs about one purchase per household. Digital coupons replace cash for essentials. Each code tracks quantity and frequency. The system feels efficient until you realize efficiency means surveillance. Buying patterns become stability metrics. Exceed your quota and your app flashes yellow. Supply equity exceeded. Please wait 48 hours. Food turns from commodity to conditioned privilege. At the source Farmland, the transformation feels harsher. Daily life on independent farms already runs thin on margins. When inflation drives seed and fuel out of reach, federal buyers arrive early with contracts promising supply guarantees and price insurance. The fine print authorizes production quotas and fixed delivery rates. Refuse and inspections follow. Environmental efficiency audit or resource utilization review. Those audits rarely end favorably. Within a month, fields once family-owned become part of regional cooperative schemes, managed by liaisons from the Department of Agriculture. Farmers remain on payroll, technically employees within a system built from their own property. The law backing this move is older than most realize. Section 101 of the Defense Production Act permits prioritization and allocation of materials for defense, including food resources, food resource facilities, and farm equipment. The President can compel performance of contracts or orders deemed necessary for national defense, which under 21st century definitions includes economic security. When currency collapse becomes categorized as a national threat, every farm becomes a federal contractor by default. Distribution follows similar logic. Major logistics companies, freight rails, trucking fleets, warehouse operators already integrate with FEMA during disasters. Under a persistent economic emergency, that cooperation formalizes. Private fleets wear federal insignia, truck manifests route through central databases deciding which region receives shipments. The term delivery delay vanishes from consumer vocabulary, replaced with allocation cycle. That cycle determines what any town eats and when. Meanwhile, Congress introduces emergency rationing acts modeled after World War II. Points aren't printed coupons anymore. They're digital credits convertible through wallets linked to social security numbers. You can't trade them, can't hoard them. Expiration dates ensure velocity of consumption to maintain agricultural demand. Black markets grow within weeks. Local exchanges trading produce, fuel, and labor under the radar. Enforcement units label them unauthorized commercial activity, citing risk of destabilizing equitable supply. Arrests occur quietly, framed as fraud prevention. The human toll hides behind comforting headlines. Imagine a couple running a small dairy in Wisconsin. Their herd feed costs triple, customers pay with collapsing dollars. Then a federal notice arrives. Pursuant to Emergency Nutrition Stabilization Directive 19, your facility is designated as a strategic dairy asset. Production quotas remain unchanged. Distribution will occur via cooperative logistics. Translation: your milk now belongs to the government until further notice. Transport trucks arrive with federal escorts. A clerk hands them a reimbursement schedule indexed to Treasury stabilization credits. Months later, those credits buy less than half a tank of feed. The family stays afloat, barely, but autonomy evaporates. Officials justify such interventions as moral necessity. No American should go hungry, the press secretary repeats. It's true, yet the guarantee transforms into leverage. Food card renewals require proof of compliance with conservation guidelines, measured water use, energy efficiency, even communications behavior analyzed by community reliability scores. Nutrition becomes a social contract. Loyal participation for guaranteed calories. Urban centers experience rationing differently. Malls convert into distribution hubs guarded by National Guard units. Citizens queue according to digital IDs, scanners verifying household entitlements. The experience feels strangely civil. Announcements thank participants for supporting national balance. After distribution, leftover stock disappears into data audits calculating inventory optimization. Few question where surpluses go. Most assume relief shipments overseas. Unaware, they refill strategic reserves against domestic unrest. Political economists will later describe this as adaptive federalism. It feels more like managerial collectivism, ownership diluted through logistics. Agribusiness giants gladly comply, their debts secured by government guarantees. Shareholders breathe relief while independents suffocate beneath compliance paperwork. The landscape of American agriculture redraws overnight, not through revolution but regulation. Even seeds and livestock genetics fall within reach. Executive orders classify them as biological assets of national interest. Private breeding farms sign licensing deals under duress, surrendering patents for emergency propagation. Innovation halts. Uniform crop strains dominate to simplify logistics. Biodiversity shrinks under the weight of efficiency. Years later, environmental reports wonder why entire harvests fail simultaneously. Trace it back to standardized seeds from that crisis year. As digital control spreads, grocery shelves become psychological theaters. Scarcity rotates geographically to demonstrate fairness. 1 week dairy short in Ohio, next week grains limited in Florida. Analysts call it rolling equilibrium. Citizens stop comparing, they adapt to delayed gratification. Media stories highlight cooperative communities sharing portions, rewriting deprivation as virtue. When people celebrate ration discipline online, confiscation achieves cultural victory. Compensation mechanisms claim fairness. Farmers receive stabilization bonds redeemable post-crisis, distribution workers earn tax exemptions, consumers enjoy discounted ration points, all funded with currency losing value by the hour. The illusion holds because everyone loses equally or appears to. Yet multinational suppliers, tied directly to federal contracts, anchor profits through indexing clauses safe from inflation. Each confiscation consolidates another monopoly wrapped in patriotic messaging. Resistance surfaces from alternative growers and local co-ops attempting barter networks. Federal agents label them unregulated food distribution entities. Websites vanish overnight, equipment cited for safety violations. A few persist quietly, trading off record produce among trusted neighbors. Over time, policies soften, voluntary registration programs promise legitimacy with oversight. Compliance ensures safety, safety ensures predictability. One signature later, autonomy folds back into the system it tried to escape. By the close of the crisis's first year, citizens barely recall buying whatever they wanted. Supermarkets function under the Agricultural Continuity Administration, part logo, part warning. Prices standard across states prevent profiteering but also profit. Eating becomes procedural, allowances downloaded weekly, recipes recommended based on caloric quotas. Meals measure loyalty. The dollar may wobble, but dinner arrives exactly when allowed. Economically, officials hail success. Inflation easing, supply stable, streets calm. The post-mortem reveals what really stabilized things: control of appetite, fuel limited motion, food limits willingness. When survival physicalizes obedience, the state no longer needs new seizures, it owns compliance itself. That's the final act before confiscation goes virtual. Once the tangible essentials, gold, savings, property, power, and food, sit under managed access, only one domain remains resistant to regulation: the digital wealth circulating beyond borders. Cryptocurrency, once the outsider's hedge, becomes the system's last unclaimed frontier. And when central authority feels comfortable rationing calories by code, digitized value is merely the next data set to absorb. The coming directive won't target hunger, it'll target autonomy wrapped in algorithms. Asset 8: Digital assets and cryptocurrency. By the time officials have rationed food and commandeered power grids, one market still moves faster than regulation: the digital one. Cryptocurrency began as a promise to resist central control, borderless and censorship-proof. But in a crisis built on collapsing faith in the dollar, that promise reads like defiance. And history shows how governments treat defiance when survival's on the line: they regulate, absorb, or erase it. The flashpoint arrives once capital fleeing devalued dollars starts pouring into crypto networks. Prices spike overnight, headlines declare digital gold replaces greenback. To authorities, that looks less like innovation and more like capital flight. The same emergency designations used to freeze banks can now target virtual exchanges. Under existing frameworks, the Bank Secrecy Act, FinCEN oversight, and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, digital assets qualify as property of economic interest. That wording gives officials everything they need: authority without new legislation. The first announcement would sound reasonable. To prevent illicit speculation and protect consumers during current market instability, cryptocurrency transactions will undergo enhanced supervision. Exchanges receive directives from the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network mandating 24-hour conversion limits and automatic reporting of large transfers. It feels bureaucratic until wallets stop sending. The backbone of decentralization, freedom of exchange, pauses with one synchronized update. Users panic, shifting to peer-to-peer networks, but internet throttling already in effect from communications control slows that exodus. Mining pools, heavy power consumers fall under energy ration quotas. Without electricity, validation nodes blink offline. Overnight, the currency of independence suffocates under policies that never mention confiscation but achieve it through infrastructure. What's left of liquidity flows toward regulated custodians for safekeeping. Those custodians, major exchanges, enter stabilization agreements with the central bank. Accounts convert from private wallets into custodial digital reserve accounts. The wording mirrors banking reforms from a century earlier. Holders receive official reassurance, balances guaranteed by the United States Treasury. Hidden clause, withdrawal subject to approval pending anti-volatility assessment. Possession redefined as participation. If that sounds implausible, the precedent exists. In 2022, Western sanctions froze Russian state reserves by crippling central bank access to clearing systems. Billions trapped instantly with a series of code edits. A domestic replay requires no rockets, just a digital collapse turned political emergency. Non-state currencies, regulators argue, threaten monetary integrity. Once branded systemic risk, they fall squarely inside emergency powers. Imagine a developer in Portland who spent years saving in crypto after losing faith in banks. When the dollar nosedives, his balance finally looks secure until his exchange receives an order. Suspend conversions, mirror all holdings to a government custody wallet labeled United Crypto Asset Repository. He checks his dashboard, the balances remain identical. Only a small note changes, value guaranteed under National Digital Stability Program. Try transferring out and a pop-up appears, transaction denied under temporary compliance review. His wealth still displays, but functionally he's broke. Officials frame the measure as a moral necessity. Speculative volatility threatens national purchasing power, the press secretary explains. We're safeguarding citizens from criminal misuse. The language echoes Roosevelt's 1933 gold rationale word for word, though now the metal's replaced by math. Within weeks, the IRS updates its database, all digital wallets linked to social security numbers for tax transparency. Non-declared addresses trigger automated letters citing potential sanctions evasion. Participation becomes mandatory compliance. FinCEN, the SEC, and the Federal Reserve cooperate on the Digital Asset Assurance Framework, a plan promising to integrate private innovations into stable monetary architecture. Translation: every exchange registers as a federal contractor. In practice, those contractors must mirror reserves to government-controlled cold storage. Traders continue buying and selling, but blocks settle through a centralized clearing node run by the very institution crypto was built to escape. The ideological revolution ends not with censorship, but with assimilation. International platforms fare no better. Under IEEPA, the president can prohibit transactions with specified foreign entities. Once emergency orders label offshore exchanges as foreign counterparties engaging in destabilizing speculation, Americans legally can't interact with them. Borderless blockchain becomes bounded by domestic firewalls. Attempting circumvention via VPN flags accounts for review. Enforcement isn't manual, it's algorithmic, enforced by pattern recognition systems built for anti-terror finance. Users banned first learn about it when their network connection times out mid-transaction. Supporters of the clampdown argue stability requires one ledger of truth. They call it transparency, technologists call it capture. Each confiscated crypto reserve strengthens the narrative that trust must flow through verified channels. Mainstream news frames holdouts as extremists undermining recovery. Prosecutors charge prominent advocates with financial sabotage under the disaster fraud prevention statutes. Within months, social consensus flips. Owning unregistered crypto feels reckless, maybe even traitorous. Yet confiscation doesn't always mean erasure. In several historical crises, governments absorbed free markets they couldn't kill. Expect a similar metamorphosis, the launch of a central bank digital currency presented as the safer descendant of private coins. The rollout advertisement reads like progress, instant settlement, zero fees, national security compliance. Every citizen receives an automatic wallet seeded with incentive credits redeemable for utilities and food. Adoption spreads faster than memory of resistance. By the second quarter of the crisis year, the government itself is the largest holder of blockchain assets because it nationalized every major wallet under temporary custodianship. Technically, owners remain credited. Legally, they've lent assets indefinitely at zero yield. When markets reopen, liquidation requires proof of compliance with tax reconciliation. Inflation has already halved value, but the digital paperwork stretches for years. The procedure masks the outcome, confiscation disguised as guardianship. Some innovators attempt building parallel privacy networks, encrypted exchanges running on radio bands or satellite relays. Emergency communications orders label those frequencies, reserved for authorized defense transmission. Equipment seized, operators fined under cybersecurity statutes. Code that once promised freedom now counts as contraband. Developers migrate abroad only to discover international cooperation clauses sharing surveillance data. 47 democracies agree that unregulated digital markets pose collective risk. Globalization turns rebellion into shared jurisdiction. Academics studying the episode years later will call it the Great Digital Nationalization. They'll note how seamlessly justification mirrored earlier patterns, stability through surrender, efficiency through exclusion. And they'll highlight how the promise of immutable ownership ended not with hacking or fraud but with compliance checkboxes. People submitted willingly because screens still displayed familiar balances. Value vanished softly, numbers intact. For citizens living it, the shift feels quieter than any past confiscation. No trucks arrive, no locks change, just wallet updates, new logos, slower approvals. Conversations about work, rent, groceries carry on, yet underneath lies a new social equation. Usage equals permission. The freedom once coded into decentralized ledgers now filtered through centralized algorithms setting transaction morality. Here's the paradox. In trying to escape the collapsing dollar, millions ran directly into digital arms capable of tracking every step. The technology built for liberation becomes the architecture of containment. When authorization replaces anonymity, government doesn't need to break the chain, it becomes the chain. Officials celebrate the achievement. Financial chaos averted, headlines proclaim. International lenders applaud America's innovative integration of digital security. Ordinary citizens, exhausted by rationing and freeze orders, embrace the calm. Few notice autonomy's absence until years later when routine audits demand verification for every historical transfer. Then they realize history didn't repeat, it uploaded. And just like that, the last untethered frontier folds into the state's ledger. Coins, wallets, and keys, once symbols of independence, now exist only as access rights granted by executive code. In one sense, confiscation succeeded perfectly, not by taking assets away, but by making ownership indistinguishable from authorization. When a government can freeze your digital wallet without touching your hand, property becomes privilege and freedom becomes conditional bandwidth. That's the end point of the collapse continuum. The moment control transcends tangibles. From gold vaults to farmland, from bank accounts to bytes, every asset becomes a file on someone else's server. And when your net worth lives inside infrastructure you don't control, the ultimate seizure needs no violence, just an update pushed overnight, accompanied by the same comforting phrase that began this entire chain. Your access is temporarily restricted for national stability. How confiscation becomes normal. Every collapse teaches the same subtle lesson. Control doesn't always roar in, it whispers policy, prints paperwork, and calls itself protection. Confiscation stops being shocking the moment people start believing it's necessary. By the time currency panic mutates into routine management, seizure has reinvented itself as stability. That's how normalization begins, not with fear but with fatigue. First comes the psychological adjustment. After months of restrictions and rationing, citizens crave predictability more than freedom. They accept phrases like temporary coordination because unpredictability feels worse. It's an emotional trade so old it barely registers. During crises, humans seek structure, governments supply it with fine print. Compliance rewards calm, resistance equals uncertainty. The population self-regulates long before enforcement matters. Officials understand this rhythm. They stage recovery announcements at precise intervals, every confiscation followed by reassurance. Reclaim gold, promise compensation. Convert retirement accounts, offer bonds, ration food, guarantee supply. The pattern builds trust through repetition. Surrender something, receive security. By the time access becomes the reward for obedience, confiscation isn't theft, it's citizenship maintenance. Language becomes the main anesthetic. Nationalization sounds harsh, stabilization fund sounds reasonable. Seizure frightens, reallocation soothes. Bureaucratic semantics act like narcotics, dulling outrage while policies tighten. Media outlets amplify this lexicon, repeating official terminology until alternate words vanish. No one says confiscated farmland, they say federally stewarded acreage. The cognitive frame shifts from losing property to sharing responsibility. Voluntary surrender accelerates the process. When citizens internalize the rhetoric of the common good, they hand over rights preemptively. If it helps the country recover, take my gold. Freeze my savings if it stops panic. Each act of patriotism sets precedent. Every precedent shortens the path to compulsion. By the next crisis, the same maneuver requires no coercion, people expect it. Contrast that with the minority who sense the drift. Legal scholars, economists, civil libertarians, they warn that normalization hardens into doctrine. When emergency powers linger, they write separation between private wealth and public purpose dissolves. Yet their caution rarely resonates amid exhaustion. Societies emerging from collapse prefer collective myths, heroic sacrifice, national unity, over uncomfortable equations about lost autonomy. This moral fog benefits legislators eager to codify temporary measures. Bills pass quietly extending emergency authorities until conditions stabilize. Months later, those clauses reappear in peacetime regulations. Banking reforms bake bail-ins into standard protocol. Digital currency frameworks enshrine transaction gatekeeping as default. Citizens adapt to periodic freezes like weather patterns, annoying but accepted. The extraordinary becomes routine through procedural repetition. Watch how media cooperation cements it. News panels avoid historical analogies, instead they discuss progressive transparency initiatives. Journalists praising efficiency replace those questioning overreach. Social media algorithms amplify compliance, posts celebrating ration discipline gain reach, while critiques about seizures get flagged as misinformation endangering recovery. The narrative loops until belief feels engineered yet comfortable. At kitchen tables, the conversation changes. People no longer ask, "Can they take this?" They ask, "When will the new guidelines arrive?" Psychological shifting happens quietly in sentences of resignation disguised as resilience. Generations later, textbooks describe these measures as adaptive governance during financial transition. Bureaucracy rewrites confiscation into civic evolution. Within agencies, officials rationalize permanence through metrics. They measure stability months without riots, production upturn, consistent currency velocity. Each data point justifies keeping the machinery alive. Departments born from crisis rename themselves, stabilization offices become continuity commissions, but purpose remains identical: manage compliance before chaos reappears. Corporations adjust too. The same industries once seized for emergency cooperation evolve into hybrid monopolies backed by government guarantees. Energy firms merge into national partnerships. Telecom giants boast about security alignment. Profit and policy intertwine so completely that dismantling one threatens the other. Citizens forget markets once operated independently. Meanwhile, the people most affected find new logic to cope. Farmers leased under stewardship speak proudly of feeding the nation. Retirees with converted accounts treat devalued annuities as proof of loyalty. Compliance transforms into identity. To reject policy becomes to reject community. And once moral meaning fuses with economic obedience, confiscation doesn't need enforcement, it lives in conscience. Occasionally, a spark of dissent surfaces. Local bartering groups off-grid settlements, encrypted traders. They call themselves preservationists, historians call them holdouts. Most dissolve under regulatory friction. Those that survive become curiosities in documentaries titled Life Beyond the System. Their existence validates official narratives. Freedom still possible, only voluntarily marginalized. Symbolic opposition keeps faith in choice alive, while ensuring no mass return to autonomy. This normalization process also redraws legal philosophy. Courts, reviewing years-old challenges, cite precedent built during emergencies. Judges declare that temporary takings under stabilization necessity fall within acceptable bounds. Each sentence fortifies the wall separating property from autonomy. Future plaintiffs face mountains of case law proving their grievances part of legitimate governance. Law ossifies policy into permanence. Inside academia, theorists craft language to make the shift sound visionary. Post-ownership economy, distributed stewardship model, resource democracy. The vocabulary feels fresh, optimistic. In seminars, students debate ethical frameworks of collective security versus individual liberty, unaware they're dissecting the aftermath of control repackaged as progress. Even opposition intellectualized ensures survival of the structure. It converts power into theory rather than confrontation. But not everyone buys the narrative. Some economists quietly argue the normalization curve can reverse through decentralization, diversified assets across jurisdictions, mutual aid controlled locally, parallel currencies experimental yet grounded. They document how historically trust restoration starts small. Villages issuing scrip, cooperatives trading labor credits, communities choosing transparency over decree. Yet even they admit scale proves fatal. Once success attracts attention, central authorities fold those systems into new regulations branded as inclusion. Independence remade into compliance again. To resist normalization, a society would need collective memory sharper than comfort allows. It would mean teaching children that the calm after collapse was purchased with consent to control, that security can metastasize. Few curricula risk that honesty. Governments reward hope, nostalgia sells better than caution. Cultural fatigue finalizes the transformation. Years after the crisis, citizens complain about bureaucracy yet defend its necessity. At least things work now, they say. Efficiency equals virtue. The phrase "for the public good" ends arguments. Nobody remembers it once justified confiscation. Deep down, people know ownership turned conditional, but the alternative chaos feels worse. Stability by surrender becomes a national ethos. That's how confiscation becomes invisible, by blending into manners, by turning compliance into decorum. Not a government seizing property, but a population volunteering control. When every measure protecting society doubles as an appropriation of it, opposition sounds paranoid and gratitude feels rational. Yet beneath this civility lies quiet erosion. Systems built on emergency never retire, they reinvent emergencies to validate themselves. A currency collapse becomes a cyber threat becomes climate security. Every generation inherits a new reason to maintain extraordinary powers. And each time, leaders promise return to normal once dangers pass. But normal left the room the moment citizens accepted permission as ownership. Still, faint resistance persists, not rebellions but recollections. The old stories whispered in workshops and late-night streams about the time accounts froze, lands reclassified, voices throttled. They end with a warning spoken softly so it doesn't trip an algorithm. Once property turns cooperative by default, freedom becomes anecdote. Normalization doesn't announce victory. It signs recurring subscriptions, updates license terms, and thanks participants for patience. And when another crisis rises, because economic cycles always return, the public won't fear seizure anymore. They'll log in, approve updates, and call it civic duty. In that final quiet, confiscation has reached perfection. It no longer needs new laws or soldiers. It sustains itself through habit, people willingly guarding the boundaries that keep them contained. Ownership remains on paper, freedom in slogans, but the machinery hums smoothly because everyone believes it's maintenance, not control. And maybe that's the saddest definition of recovery, the moment society mistakes managed dependence for peace. The final exchange we never agreed to. The collapse never ends with chaos, it ends with signatures. Documents stamped, emergency resolutions, people nodding quietly, screens flashing reassurance. Ownership doesn't vanish, it just migrates from hands to databases, from citizens to custodians. The system you built your life around keeps functioning, but now you borrow your own freedom by renewing permissions. Every confiscation along the chain, gold, savings, land, power, food, data, culminates here. Crisis didn't destroy property, obedience redefined it. What used to guarantee security became a form of collateral ensuring compliance. The Constitution still promises liberty. The fine print translates that promise into licensed access. What began as temporary oversight matures into permanent governance by consent. Not all these powers will be used, but they're ready, codified in laws, tested during recessions, perfected in digital code. The precedent already breathes inside every just-in-case statute and contingency clause. The reality hiding beneath calm language is simple. The next command doesn't need announcement. When stability demands control, control executes automatically. That homeowner from Ohio, staring at the frozen account on day one, maybe that isn't prophecy. Maybe it's preparation. Because systems survive by rehearsing collapse. And each rehearsal drills us deeper into compliance until scarcity feels normal and permission feels polite. The final exchange isn't measured in currency. It's measured in trust we surrendered for calm. In every generation, a new disaster will justify more of it, traded away willingly. And one day the announcement won't shock anyone. It'll sound routine, just another update, another adjustment, another safeguard. So remember that frozen screen. It's not fiction, it's a forecast of how quietly ownership turns conditional. In the next emergency, property won't be taken. It'll be redefined. If you want to know how citizens once reclaimed what they lost, stay for the next story, because autonomy once ceded always demands rediscovery.